Since the first reported cases in 1982, South Africa's HIV/AIDS epidemic developed into the world's most severe in the late 1990s and early 2000s, fueled by apartheid-era inequalities and a post-apartheid denialism that fostered the emergence of a broad civil society movement to reverse it. Here to speak about the virus's deadly history in South Africa is Mandisa Mbali of the University of Cape Town's History Department. Research focuses on histories of health policy and activism in South Africa and internationally. Her extensive published output includes chapters, journal articles, and a scholarly monograph, South African AIDS Activism and Global Health Politics, which featured as part of Palgrave Macmillan's Global Ethics series. More recently, her work has analyzed transnational debates over apartheid and medical humanitarianism in South Africa. Welcome, Mandisa.
Thank you. For the ignorant among us, what do the acronyms HIV and AIDS stand for, and what should we know about how they entered South Africa?
HIV is a human immunodeficiency virus, and AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. With South Africa, there's a couple of different parts. I think the historical epidemiology is something that we could examine further, in my view. But the earliest two cases were these white gay men who were flight attendants with SAA. Now, a bit similar to Jaitan Degar, one of the early patients in the United States. He was Canadian, actually, as well. I wanted to mention that. You know, the way that they lived provided lots of opportunities to have multiple sexual partners, which prior to the emergence of AIDS was, you know, it was not an epidemiological problem in that sense. But so there was that white gay men who were traveling and who, you know, were getting HIV and, you know, there was transmission that was happening. But moreover, there were also Malawian mine workers who we know that the migrant labour system involved mine workers being separated from their families for long periods of time. And as such, this racist system of capitalism actually meant that they often, you know, engaged in sex with sex workers. And we know that sex workers are what we would now call a most at-risk population. They're vulnerable to HIV infection. But there was a further dimension to this that was even more controversial and came up later, which is that ANC cadres, particularly those in Mkhonto Wesizwe, they actually also, in terms of their, you know, involvement in, you know, missions abroad, they also, in some instances, acquired HIV infection. Again, I would blame this on the racist regime, the fact that they were, in a sense, you know, they were forced migrants because of the struggle and separated from their families, a long way from home. And that, a bit like the miners, kind of fostered structurally determined vulnerability to HIV infection. But a very important point for me is that virologists at the time writing in South African Medical Journal, they were saying, well, there's two epidemics. There's clade B, which is the white gay men. And then they were saying there's clade C, which is the African migrants. But the reality, I think, was much more complicated than that, because it was presuming that there weren't black gay men, and that also there wasn't interracial sex going on. And, you know, we know those things weren't true. So Carla Sampiris has done a magisterial sort of research on this topic, on the racist and homophobic biases baked into like early articles in South African Medical Journal, which I could say much more about, because the Medical Association of South Africa was a racist organization that was involved in sort of covering up and trying to sanitize the involvement of white South African doctors in the death in detention of Steve Biko. So we know it was a racist organization in any event.
You've told us a bit about the government's response and also about the ANC and Exile's response. What is the situation in broad brush strokes that the ANC government inherited in 1994 as far as the HIV situation in South Africa is concerned?
Well, first up, we have to recognise that the Immorality Act not only prohibited interracial sex, but also gay sexual activity. And there was sort of a restriction on freedom of association. I mean, obviously there was a business about, you know, African nationalist and communist black-led organisations being banned and political prisoners and people being forced into exile. But there was also the not minor matter of the fact that gay men meeting with each other, you know, for sexual reasons was banned, right? So there was also censorship of, you know, frank and sensible sexual educational materials targeted at gay men, because the regime was, you know, inspired by Calvinism. And there was this kind of social conservatism that permeated South African society, to the extent that what you would find is that pornographic magazines used to have stars covering the nipples. And so frank and scientific AIDS educational material designed by gay men themselves, that was, you know, not allowed. But there was also the fact that the Gay Association of South Africa was reluctant to address the issue head on because of concerns about homophobia. But there was a further matter, which is at the same time, Simon Segel and Colley, an icon of the, you know, LGBTIQ movement. In those days, it was known as lesbian and gay activism. The sort of rainbow umbrella only evolved later on. But he was rejected by or isolated by the Gay Association of South Africa when he was part of the treason trial. Masiea Lekota was also part of that because he was involved in the township uprising in the 1980s. And so they rejected him, this white-dominated organization. And this sparked big controversy in terms of gay rights movements internationally, in that the Gay Association of South Africa became isolated within the movement. And they were sending letters to Simon in prison, letters of support, Christmas cards. Someone like Peter Tatchell, for example, he was very involved in supporting Simon. So the movement became completely splintered and divided, but also, you know, the majority of our population was and is Black. So most people who are gay or who are men who have sex with men, they're Black. So as such, effective AIDS educational material had to reflect that. And even better was when they started, the Black gay men, this was after Simon was released, started designing their own material. So they set up something called the Township AIDS Project. And it was him and then Bev Ditzi, another icon of, you know, progressive lesbian and gay activism. They were working tirelessly to try to build awareness. But this was an NGO-related project. The government wasn't taking this up. So then the issue of things coming to scale was not happening. But also the government had vague things like, you know, things saying like stop AIDS, but without telling people actually how to prevent HIV transmission. But moreover, there was something called the Yellow Hand campaign in the 90s, which was really like ridiculous. One of the big advertising firms in South Africa designed it, obviously white-led and white-dominated. And as such, it wasn't culturally appropriate. But there were some people in the regime who did some things around it. I think the health minister's name was Rena Venter. She did some things, But again, they weren't culturally appropriate. They weren't driven by people living with and vulnerable to HIV. And so it kind of came to naught, really. But then in terms of like the struggle and what was happening in the late 80s and early 90s, we know that the struggle to, make the country ungovernable and to overthrow the regime was very intense, like in the late 1990s, and people's attention in the ANC was very much consumed with that. But then in 1990, by the time the political prisoners were released, Mandela was released, and the prospect of negotiations came up. What happened with the negotiations is people often forget that the miracle narrative, right, it hides just how uncertain things were at many moments. The extent of the political violence in the 90s is staggering. People often also forget that. So there were other things that understandably they had to focus on, namely the Cadessa talks. Also, there were horrible things like the Boy Patong massacre, the assassination of Chris Hani. So they had like a lot on their plate. They were involved. There was a National AIDS Convention of South Africa, which remarkably enough brought together the different political parties and also civil society organizations. The AIDS charter they came up with wasn't bad. But there was also, after the 94 elections, there were like 13 departments of health. There were ones from all the Bantuistans, and then there were the ones from all the provinces. But remember also, the provinces became 9 provinces. So the whole health system had to be reorganized, but also historically, that our health system was segregated on grounds of race. We know the facilities that were set aside for Black people. By Black people, I mean African coloured and Indian, right? That were set aside for them were of inferior quality compared to those of white people. So we know that from reading Baldwin McGavin et al.'s great book, An Ambulance of the Wrong Colour. So there was a lot to sort out. There was the issue of free healthcare for pregnant women, for under 5s. Also, Nkosazana, then Zuma, the Dlamini, she added a double barrel at a later stage. She, as the health minister, also did a lot of work, with tobacco control. But at this point, the issue of AIDS started to become, in the late 90s, difficult to ignore because of the increasing infection and death rates. And there was also the hideous matter of pediatric AIDS, which perhaps we can talk about in a minute. So, like, my overall estimation is like the late 80s, early 90s, there were things happening. But the bigger issue of the need for a non-racial democratic South Africa understandably meant that the focus was somewhat divided, and also the need to transform the health system. So I don't feel in that period we can be too harsh on the ANC. There were efforts, but there were other things to focus on, like that there needed to be a democratic South Africa before you could have an effective response to HIV/AIDS.
So let's talk about the response when it came along. And there were quite a few controversies as well. Thinking of Sarafina II and Virodene. So tell us about those controversies within that particular context.
So with Sarafina II, it's very interesting. So the movie Sarafina was a great hit. And the playwright was very famous. Mbongeni Ngema, he produced a lot of landmark pieces of South African theatre. The issue there was manifold. First up, there wasn't an open tender process in the way that there should have been. It was clear that in the tender process, he was being favoritized over other theatrical groups who had more of a track record in terms of HIV prevention education. But there were further things that came up in my interviews with AIDS activists for my book, like the elements of the plot that were like sexist and undermined the type of messaging that there should have been around how sexism shapes women's vulnerability to HIV infection. But there were also things like the big issue then became the fact that the tender was inflated. So it was 14.2 million rand, which, you know, compared to contemporary corruption, perhaps seems like small change. But in those days, and you know, the money of those days, it was a great deal. And some of the tour that they were supposed to go around on buses across the country, some of the tour didn't even take place. And so we had this then new institution called the Public Protector, kind of ombud, who in recent times, that role has been extremely important in terms of accountability for corruption. But in those days, the Public Protector was Selby Bakwa, and he produced a damning report on the fact the tender was inflated, and the way that the Sarafina tender, also the way that that playwright was favoritized in terms of how the tender was awarded. So there was that. But then I think with that, we have to proceed with caution when we consider it, because like I said, there was the new health system that was being designed, also with procurement and managing it correctly. That was something that to some extent was still being clarified, I think, by the new government, how to manage tenders and procurement. So it's not an excuse per se, but I don't think it was done in a way that was malicious. I think there was an effort that was made. It was wrong what happened. But compared to later AIDS-related scandals, it starts to look quite a bit less harmful. Then there was this so-called miracle cure that emerged, right, called Virodene. But just to go back slightly, that was in 1997. But then to go back slightly to 1996, in terms of the global north, there was this miracle breakthrough in terms of HIV treatment. You know, David Ho at the Erin Diamond Institute in New York had found that if you use 3 different kinds of antiretrovirals in combination with different mechanisms of action, then what could happen is that the viral replication could be hindered and the immune system could make a recovery. So AIDS patients who'd previously, you know, been forced to accept that they had a life-threatening illness that, you know, was essentially a terminal illness ultimately. These patients were like making miraculous immune system recoveries. They were getting their lives back. But then what was happening in South Africa is these drugs were too expensive. You know, more about that shortly. So Virodene, by contrast with highly active antiretroviral therapy, also known as triple therapy, today we just refer to ARVs, slightly more manageable acronym in my view. Anyway, so there were these 2 individuals who claimed that they'd created this AIDS drug that was a miracle cure, and it was called Virodene. Now, pressure was placed on our medical regulatory authority, the Medicines Control Council, to approve this drug. But the problem was it hadn't gone through proper clinical trials. So there's 3 phases, you know, of clinical trials. There's one that is a basic check if it actually might work, like in the lab. Then it's tested on animals frequently, and then a small number of humans to check for some basic safety, and then a large number of humans, the patients affected by the disease, and they're double-blinded, randomized control trials. This didn't happen with Virodene, and the scientists quickly uncovered, the ones who followed an evidence-based approach to, you know, the clinical management of HIV/AIDS, that it was an industrial solvent. So not only did it not, you know, cure or even treat HIV/AIDS, it was actually harmful to humans. Now, Thabo Mbeki started placing pressure on the Medicines Control Council to approve this drug, but then they held firm. I think the regulator's name was Peter Volb. They held firm on not approving the drug, thank goodness. But the problem is that there was still some promotion of it that was around. So it sort of rumbled on for a long time, but it didn't go well in terms of the government showing that it was following an evidence-based approach. And later, Mbeki's AIDS denialism resulted in hundreds of thousands of preventable AIDS deaths. So for me, in terms of pseudoscience, it was kind of like Virodene was the canary in the coal mine.
The Treatment Action Campaign is founded in 1998. Can you tell us about what it is and its role and function in the struggle against AIDS?
Okay, so the Treatment Action Campaign, so just to fast forward a bit, right? Simon Colley tragically dies, from AIDS. And then activists at the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality, they start, heck, we've been pushing for law reform, critical, there was the breakthrough in our Bill of Rights, they successfully pushed for non-discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, and then a cascade of litigation and law reform around issues such as domestic partnership, marriage. The first order of business was obviously the sodomy law and having that scrapped. But then they started on the back of these legislative successes. The issue of HIV/AIDS was becoming more and more acute, and Akoli's death showed that. But activists like Zaki Ahmad, they were plugged into global networks around, lesbian and gay activism. And Zaki connected with activists like Greg Gonsalves at the Gay Men's Health Crisis. And he told them about this miracle breakthrough, how it was really changing people's lives, saving lives. And so as a consequence of that, the lesbian and gay activists started pushing more for these drugs. They started looking at why these drugs not available in South Africa, this combination therapy. And so Zaki Ahmad made a decision to found the Treatment Action Campaign. Now, Ahmad, in and of his own right, is a fascinating figure, both in terms of the history of the lesbian and gay movement, as it was then known, and in terms of AIDS activism. In so much as when he himself found out he was HIV positive, he fell into this deep depression for a while, but ultimately came to the realization that there needed to be this rollout of HIV treatment. So, but it wasn't just Akoli's death. What happened also is that groups like former anti-apartheid health activists, who then I think we could describe as progressive health activists, they got sick and tired of going to pediatric wards and seeing these babies who were emaciated, who were dying, often before their third birthday. That was a typical kind of thing. Like, and Cozy Johnson, who was an AIDS activist, when he died, in early adolescence, that wasn't a real exception to the rule. Most children with AIDS, were doomed from very early on. So not just that, but also adult wards filled with young people with TB and HIV, because TB is the most common opportunistic infection. And so they joined forces and said, we need this Treatment Action Campaign. Now, first of all, what they did is they focused on prevention of mother-to-child transmission. And two different drugs, one of which is called AZT, and the other one, nevirapine. With nevirapine, what was particularly useful about it is that the drugs were very expensive in those days. They still are, other drugs, but nevirapine and AZT, I'm referring to specifically here. There were earlier studies like in Thailand, that showed if a woman took a short course, a pregnant woman, of AZT, she could prevent passing on the HIV. It could be prevented, the transmission from mother to child. But then with Viropine, there was a further breakthrough in that all that had to happen is the woman had to take 1 dose and the baby 1 dose. Now, obviously, to radically cut pediatric AIDS occurring through vertical transmission from mother to child. And its efficacy was, I think, in the range of like reducing such infections by 50%. Also, for a developing country context, it was extremely manageable. Because, like I said, 2 doses. So the activists started pushing for that. Now, there were various twists and turns to it all, with them trying to push Nkosazana Zuma to, roll out the drugs. But what started to happen is that around the same time, President Thabo Mbeki, he started sort of reaching through the dark corners of the internet. By that, I mean kind of nebulous and, corners, obscure websites, and found this group of people called the AIDS dissidents, David Rasnick, Peter Duesberg, and so on. Now, they were scientists in the United States who previously, their hypotheses that HIV did not cause AIDS were perhaps more credible because there was scientific uncertainty up until HIV was diagnosed as the cause of AIDS. But they stuck to their views despite the fact that the evidence had galloped along. And like I said, after 1996, there were these effective antiretroviral treatments, which further showed that HIV was the cause, right? And also that there was this incredible medical breakthrough around the treatment. So he found these individuals who then, these scientists, I would argue pseudoscientists, who then said it's caused by things like poor nutrition, for example. And so then what started to happen is that the activists were pushing for the rollout of ARVs to prevent mother-to-child transmission, but not getting anywhere. And so eventually they launched constitutional litigation. So there's part of our constitution called Section 27 that guarantees the right to access to healthcare services. It's very progressive because it places an onus on the state to progressively realise that right. But there's also an understanding that it has to be done, the resource limitations, and it has to be done, with an understanding of available resources. They launched this case and were successful. First case that proved that, not proved, but expanded on the jurisprudence. It was precedent setting around the government's obligation to progressively realise the right to access to healthcare services. Now, if you look at those, the judgment, it's extremely interesting because it also says that government policy in this regard has to pass the test of reasonableness. So the reasons that the Ministry of Health were putting forward for not providing the Viropine were unreasonable. So one of the irrational things is what they did is they set up these research and training sites, which they call pilot sites. So only in certain antenatal facilities would a woman be provided and a baby with the Viropine to prevent pediatric AIDS. But then what about the women, activists ask, who live in other areas, who are far away from these limited number of research and training sites? Didn't they also have the right to access to healthcare services and also, their children to be born free of HIV? And so this landmark ruling is still cited and admired to this day. Previously, there had been one court case around a patient by the name of Subramani, and it was dealing with kidney dialysis, and the court ruled against him and in favour of the Department of Health. So this was really important. This case, though, the TAC versus Minister of Health, it's really important because if you put it alongside the Grootboom ruling, it was one of the really important ones in those days around socio-economic rights. But at the same time, if we just circle back to President Mbeki's AIDS denialism, for me, we have to recognise a few things. So first up, under the GEAR policy, the GEAR economic policy, the government had committed itself to what it termed fiscal discipline. And so the budget for things like health services, they decided to limit it. At the same time, there was another issue, which was the trade and intellectual property issue. So they'd signed up to be part of the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization had this dreadful trade agreement from the standpoint of human rights called the Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Agreement, or TRIPS. TRIPS committed signatory nations to these long, inflexible 20-year patents on medicines, but it didn't take account of the issue of essential medicines, and that the price of medicines was really significant in terms of patients' ability to access them, particularly in developing countries. So Mbeki also was faced with the reality of artificially inflated drug pricing, not just in relation to ARVs, but in relation to other drugs. So there were these kind of constraints. I mean, and at the same time, what the Treatment Action Campaign was doing was not just challenging Mbeki's AIDS denialism, but also challenging pharmaceutical industry greed, an issue that persists to the present day. Now, what had happened in the meantime is, at the same time as the Virodene thing, so there was a lot happening at once. There was something called the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, or PMA. They were an industry body that represented 40 large Western multinational drug companies. Now, what Zuma had done, which was very admirable, is that she had passed something called the Medicines and Related Substances Act. And what this, if I may shorten it, Medicines Act, what it did was it enabled the government to issue compulsory licenses to force drug companies to share their know-how, the information patented, with generic drug companies who would then produce cheaper copies. Now, how it works with generics is that it challenges pharmaceutical industry monopolization. So if you think about it, it's like anything. If there's only one firm that produces something, they can set whatever price they like. Whereas if there's competition, there's more than one firm that produces something, then prices go down. So with that aspect of the Medicines Act, the pharmaceutical industry hated multinationals. And then there was also parallel importation that was included in the Medicines Act. So this parallel importation, what it consisted and still consists of, is importing drugs from countries where they're cheaper. So this is another nefarious thing the pharmaceutical did and still does. They set different prices for different countries on grounds that often lack rationality. It's a great deal I could say about this, but for our intents and purposes, what we can note, just to circle back, is that the industry was trying to block sections of the Medicines Act. I think it was 15C. And it was, hindering the government's ability then to roll out previously, drugs that were expensive, like antiretrovirals. So there was also the pricing issue. So what happened is, in this case, I've called it Pharma v. Mandela. Pharma's a sort of colloquial expression for, I don't think it's colloquial, but it's a term used in AIDS policy circles and in health policy circles in general to refer to big pharma, so to like multinational pharmaceutical companies, ones like Pfizer, Glaxo, and so on. So they wanted these sections of the Act struck out. Treatment Action Campaign joined the litigation on the side of the Mandela administration as an amicus curiae. So they were allowed to provide the court with evidence relevant to the case. Their court papers, the Treatment Action Campaign amicus brief, is really, really interesting because it's very detailed, and some of the arguments are really fascinating. So one of them that they presented, so one of the industry's arguments was that they spent the profits derived from the market monopolization, you know, profits from their monopoly, they poured it back into research. But one of the realities is that the National Institutes of Health was actually funding a lot of the basic science. And as such, you know, that argument was partially undermined. But there's also the not minor matter that pharmaceutical companies, they often spend a great deal on marketing their drugs to doctors. There's many examples that I could give around this. But what we can see is that there were various elements of that argument that the Treatment Action Campaign picked apart. I think we can refer to both cases as being examples of legal activism, legal human rights related activism. So what happened is that then there was another track to this, not just the amicus briefing, but very public and vocal activism led by people living with HIV/AIDS within the Treatment Action Campaign. So they had these T-shirts saying HIV positive, trying to break the silence, break the stigma, and show that people, there were real people that were affected by this lack of access to the life-saving drugs. But what Zaki Ahmad did is he then engaged in something that I referred to as a drug fast. So he refused to take antiretrovirals until they were made available to everyone who needed them. This attracted a lot of media attention, obviously. He was named as one of Time's People of the Year. He was working, you know, media circuits aggressively. He was a spokesperson for the movement. But also in terms of our own local television, in those days there was a program called Third Degree, which was like a current affairs program, but whereby the presenter would, you know, enable debates or ask public figures tough questions. And there was a debate between Mariana Deeb, who represented the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, and Zaki Ahmad. And Ahmad just destroyed her argument, picked it apart. And things like that really, I think, were important in bringing the South African, you know, public on side. But there's also, for example, they used the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Health to hammer home their point about the need for more affordable drugs. So there was this activist who was formerly I think he was an SACP activist, Chris Maraka, and he talked about how the expensive price of drugs meant that he was essentially dying. He was extremely emaciated. But that also shows the socialist strand of the movement, I would argue, which was quite strong. So they were doing both at the same time. But what was happening also is that then this global movement started crystallizing. So there were groups like AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP in New York, who'd done incredible work pushing the NIH and FDA to really advance and accelerate research around HIV treatment. This was in like the 80s and early 90s. But so there was them, Gay Men's Health Crisis. There were various new groups as well who were interested in a global rollout of HIV treatment. Also, like Public Citizen was involved, Doctors Without Borders. By that I mean Médecins Sans Frontières. So there were various groups who were all coming together, not just on the patent issue, but also on the issue of the need for radically ramped up funding for a global rollout of antiretrovirals. Also debt relief for heavily indebted countries. Unfortunately, to my mind, that pillar of activism, that's part of the unfinished business. But I suppose you could say the same thing about funding to fight global AIDS. But they were pushing for a radical reworking of global health architecture with like very profound impacts. Also, the global movement pushed for the WTO to pass the Doha Declaration, which was at the WTO meeting in Doha, which enabled countries to produce generics in the event of a health emergency. Produce generics, rather what I mean is like force the production of generics through the issuing of compulsory licenses. So profound impacts of foreign aid globally, global trade, also getting countries in the global north to take what was happening with global AIDS seriously as a foreign policy issue. So big impacts on diplomacy, global diplomacy and governance.
A momentum that's gathering both locally and internationally. But you've referred a few times to Mbeki's AIDS denialism, and he comes presidency 9. And then, of course, Manto Tshabalala-Msimang, who's also something of a lightning rod during these years. I shall forever associate her with lemons, garlic, and sweet potatoes. Could you tell us a bit about, the extent to which she became the lightning rod?
It's all very sad. If we look at her and Nkosazana Zuma, in other respects, they weren't bad health ministers. But this was the big challenge. This was the leading cause of death. Our Medical Research Council had shown that, the depth of the crisis. So she kind of jumped on Mbeki's bandwagon, right? But he was obviously he was the president of the country, but also incredibly powerful in the ANC. And in many ways, he was a political operator. In other spheres, his legacy is perhaps more positive. But what happened is she kind of jumped on this whole nutrition business. Also, there were things about what he said that in other senses were true, like the idea that poverty causes AIDS. What I'm trying to say here is obviously clinical outcomes in a patient with HIV who is malnourished will not be as good as those clinical outcomes. I'm talking about ARVs here, those clinical outcomes in patients who are better fed, who have a nutritionally balanced diet, that meets their nutritional needs. So obviously it's very important that people have adequate nutrition, but the problem is adequate nutrition in and of itself cannot treat HIV. And that was the myth that they were peddling, right? So the way that also she picked and choose certain, nutritional interventions also struck doctors as odd. And some of the things that she was proposing were actually expensive, like tone deaf for South Africans reliant on social grants. Olive oil, it's become even more expensive recently. But in those days, it was also an expensive intervention. But sadly, some patients with HIV did try this route of the diet, as it were, or also turning to traditional healers. There were some unscrupulous traditional healers who would claim to be able to cure AIDS. Again, it's very important to recognize therapeutic diversity in South Africa. Traditional healers have their place in our health system. They should collaborate with doctors in the best interests of patients, particularly, I believe, in relation to mental health and community support for patients. Very important, right? But then unscrupulous traditional healers who were claiming to cure AIDS, that was extremely dangerous in terms of what it meant for patients. So her taking up this kind of ridiculous diet was really sad, but also this focus on vitamin supplements was odd. Now, vitamin supplements, again, they can be clinically indicated that they can play a very positive role in a patient's life, but they can't cure HIV, frankly. I mean, there's still this pseudoscientific nonsense that's dangerous that's going around now, the social media, in terms of saying vitamins can cure cancer, they can cure AIDS. It's wishful thinking, but it's really terrifying what it means for patients. But in any event, so she jumped on this bandwagon, and then there was this guy called Matthias Rath, who, you know, was trying to peddle these vitamins. And also there were these advertisements in newspapers that were highly unethical, also where he claimed that the vitamins could treat HIV. And so there was also activism on that front. So the treatment action campaign is interesting because they were fighting on multiple fronts, right? There was for more affordable AIDS drugs through generic competition, intellectual property and trade law to facilitate that. Then there was the issue of tackling Mbeki's AIDS denialism and Manto Tshabalala as the implementer thereof. But then there was the global level. There was the need for adequate funding to fight global AIDS and trade agreements, which enabled a rollout of HIV treatment in developing countries. So there is a sophisticated movement. They're working on many different fronts. But also what appeared to happen with Tshabalala-Msimang is that she seemed, to my mind, quite unstable towards the end. And unfortunately, she appeared to struggle with, alcohol abuse. And I think she tragically died of those causes. But if you think about it, I also think, again, on balance, life in exile was extremely taxing on people psychologically. And, she might have been sitting with quite a lot of different things personally. So we have to also bear that in mind. But at the same time, latching on to vitamins and an odd diet is, in my view, inexcusable, especially because there were doctors at the time, Black doctors like William Malakapuru Makhoba, who were availing themselves to the president and Manto Tshabalala-Msimang to explain it all. There were also doctors like Jerry Kuvadia, the icon of the struggle in terms of progressive health activism, who were also available to assist with this. I mean, Makhoba tried, but he just didn't get anywhere. Like, Mbeki just wouldn't budge on this particular issue, which was odd. But also, I've always argued that part of the problem is that there's a history of racism around African sexuality, the idea of Africans as hypersexualized, as promiscuous, and that his concern was around the emphasis on this sexually transmitted illness partly spread by multiple concurrent sexual relationships, was re-emphasizing these racist ideas. But really what it boiled down to is that the doctors who were treating these patients, most of whom were Black and poor, were actually operating in a human rights framework and had been involved in organizations like the National Medical and Dental Association, which was very progressive during the 80s, early 90s on the topic of ending segregation in the health system, of having a progressive health system. So he was almost like fighting against the wrong target. But also it was a real challenge because, he just wouldn't shift. But in some ways, plus ça changé, because now we see similar things with, Donald Trump, with his embrace of pseudoscience through Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So this is also why Americans could study our history around AIDS. Maybe there could be some pointers, could swap notes on what that's like and what it means. Pseudoscience driving health policy.
After Mbeki from 2007 onwards, especially under the Zuma administration, what are the key changes in South African government's responses to the pandemic, and what are changes in numbers in terms of the impact of the pandemic? Sorry.
Well, what happened at that time is that Barbara Hogan took over for a while in terms of running the health ministry. Later, it was Erin Motsoaledi. And they took the need for a rollout very seriously. And it started to happen in earnest. Because the Cabinet's 2003 operational plan, where the Treatment Action Campaign had forced them to do a full rollout through the civil disobedience campaign that they did, that didn't go far enough. It had quite modest targets that didn't match the need. So it was really significant that this rollout happened really, really, it was taken seriously. And in terms of the Zuma administration, I would say the first round, I would say this was one of his signature achievements. Now, again, it's important to be balanced, in life, because many other things about his administration were absolutely disastrous for our country in terms of corruption, mismanagement, the way that the security cluster was compromised, all the stuff that Jacques Poe talks about in his book, The President's Keepers. All of that happened. But at the same time, again, this issue of AIDS is one thing that was more positive. But I would like to issue one caveat, namely that during his rape trial, he said some things that were very regressive and downright alarming in terms of sexism. So he raped an AIDS activist, and he then said that because she was wearing a kanga, she was inviting him to have sex with her, which is rubbish. There's no excuse to rape a woman. Her clothing is neither here nor there. But then also the next day, to avoid HIV infection, he took a shower, which again is pseudoscientific and downright alarming. It's wishful thinking that taking a shower after having sex can prevent HIV infection. And then there was a matter of the fact that she was hounded in terms of violent threats and actual violence out of the country. She was basically sent into political exile, in a sense. She was exiled because of her political activism around women's rights and the issue of HIV/AIDS. So in terms of prevention, I think he was disastrous. But in terms of access to HIV treatment, I think incredibly positive. There's also something that I should definitely mention, which is that if a patient's viral load is adequately managed through HIV treatment, i.e. ramped down as low as possible, then the risk of HIV transmission reduces enormously. So hence the global consensus moved to test and treat. So we should still be doing this, right? As many South Africans as possible. Let me rather say people who live in South Africa, because we also have undocumented migrants and migrants to this country. Anyone who lives in South Africa who is sexually active should be tested for HIV. And then ideally, anyone who's HIV positive should start treatment immediately. And if that was happening, if our health system was working around that, but also if we could challenge stigma, things would look quite different in terms of new infections, but also avoiding AIDS deaths. But it changed the picture. And in actual fact, what was starting to happen before the rollout is it was changing our population pyramid. So because so many young people were dying, and also like infants, it meant that a larger proportion of the population was older. But also there were these really terrible things like child-headed households and the millions of AIDS orphans. So rolling out ARVs, I think it's had profound social impacts in that less children are orphans today, more young people are alive, less grandmothers are looking after 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds in ways that, were exhausting. There were a lot of grandmothers who couldn't enjoy their old age. In addition to having lost a child, then suddenly, age 60, 70, 80, having to look after children afresh with their own needs and health problems. So, and then having had to nurse children through an AIDS-related death. So all of those things, all of those terrible social phenomena have been radically diminished through the rollout of antiretrovirals. Now, there's a lot I want to say about current threats and opportunities around HIV treatment. But let me say, it's one of the great achievements of post-apartheid activism is forcing the government to do that. It's significant. Millions of lives have been saved because of that, the human rights activism I'm talking about.
Then, given this massive achievement, and I like the way in which you frame it as civil activism, you're right there, but then at the same time, the amount of money that comes from abroad, on which we've become dependent. And now we've seen the Trump administration cutting support for HIV/AIDS programs. From what I gather, is the Senate and Congress actually fought back against that recently, but it's very, very difficult. What are the impacts that these cuts might have on our programs? Because infections do still occur at, unfortunately, still very high rates.
Indeed, it's devastating. Let me say, though, that the government, the National Treasury, does set aside a budget for health expenditure, and antiretrovirals are widely available in the public sector. To my mind, there's some missing drugs from our, if I may, armament, from our suite of clinical interventions. More on that shortly. But it is, I don't think our antiretroviral program is going to directly collapse. But I have some it's going to fray at the edges, and it's already happening. So one thing is that in many public facilities, the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief has been funding data capturing. Just to hit the pause button as a sidebar, the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, was another signature achievement of the global movement, the global HIV treatment access movement. Because what happened is the allies of the treatment action campaign in the United States started to push very hard for the creation of a presidential AIDS initiative, which would provide billions of dollars to roll out HIV. Now, President George W. Bush, surprisingly enough, came up with a plan to, provide billions of dollars to roll out HIV treatment in 15 heavily affected African and Caribbean countries. This was amazing. But we have to be careful here because, as Luke Messax argued, this also was driven by the fact that American evangelicals started getting interested. So folks from like Samaritan's Purse, and then they effectively pushed Bush. So it came from his Christian evangelical convictions. But so I think that the data capturing is one part of it. I think also some clinicians, their posts were funded by PEPFAR. And also, one second, I also must add USAID, which was their foreign AIDS program, now effectively abolished. And so there's that. I think that a specific concern of mine is to return to the topic of most at-risk populations. So there are groups in our society of people who experience discrimination that impact upon their ability to prevent, acquiring HIV. These groups include transgender and gender non-conforming people, especially transgender women, sex workers, prisoners, people who use drugs. And what you saw is that PEPFAR was funding really effective HIV treatment and prevention programs among some of these groups, particularly, for example, at Bits University, transgender individuals. Now, that initiative has been effectively, the funding for that has been scrapped, is my understanding, that's closed down, which is devastating. But also they have the American administration and the right in America have this idea of being anti-diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI. And they also have this construct called being woke, which marginalized people themselves do not use that term. It's a social construct. And so what you actually see is also them coming up with lies. Like, one of the things that I read the other day is that Elon Musk said, well, with USAID, you remember he got the chainsaw and he said, we're going to scrap USAID. One of the myths was that USAID sent 50,000 condoms to Gaza, which is rubbish. USAID was funding things, you know, that were really critical in terms of the global AIDS response in heavily affected populations, in heavily affected countries, evidence-based, targeted, and so on. Not just random decisions made, not based on evidence. So there's that. I've also heard accounts. I know that one of my students documented the really effective provision of HIV treatment and prevention in prisons. That's also gone. So one of the tasks, actually, and I challenge a historian to do this, or an anthropologist, is actually to map the exact impact. Where is it happening? What does it mean for people's lives? And then you ideally have an epidemiologist too. What's happening in terms of new infections and deaths and AIDS-related sickness in these patients linked to these facilities? So in actual fact, but the one thing that I'm super frustrated about is the organizations that would have funded work to do this, if there was another driver of the collapse of parts of an ARV program, are the very ones that have been scrapped. So PEPFAR, USAID. Now I've heard there's a risk of the joint UN program on HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS, being folded into WHO, and then will it once more, AIDS once more, become a deprioritized illness? So it's a crisis on many, many fronts. So it's going to be concentrated in vulnerable groups. I think it's going to be concentrated in particular clinics. But I'm not convinced in South Africa, with the budgetary constraints that we sit with our level of debt, and there's many, many competing priorities in terms of government expenditure. I'm unconvinced that our, fiscus would enable us to pick up all of the slack in terms of projects that have been shut down. We need to see the evidence. But there's a further matter which is hideous, which is the pseudoscience, driving policy, making it the National Institutes of Health. So also our scientists are suffering because NIH funding has been withdrawn. And for example, there's a colleague here who's working on a TB vaccination who has mentioned the profound impacts. And we need a TB vaccination. It would be fantastic in terms of South African public health. It shouldn't wait. It should happen as soon as possible in terms of our public health needs. So it can't go on the back burner. Other donors can't necessarily pick up the slack. So in essence, what Trump is doing is their legitimacy, their soft power, is basically a massive plank of it is gone. So it's not just the humanitarian impacts. It's not just the impact on human progress in terms of science. I think their reputation of the United States at the moment, talking about the United States as like a state entity, it's shot, it's gone in developing countries for now. So that it's actually, I think, an own goal. Like when Bush did that, when the program was created, it created so much goodwill. But now the business about PEPFAR having been quote unquote rescued, it's true, it's significant. But parts of the program they've been shut down. I think they're going to stay shut down. I'm not suddenly seeing them deciding to reinstate programs dealing with the HIV prevention and treatment needs of transgender individuals. There's also uncertainty, and there's been this kind of zigzagging. because there were 3 months where there was a halt to all foreign aid. How many babies were born with HIV in that period? It's not like a pregnant woman can just hit pause in terms of HIV treatment. It has to be consistent. But I think the bipartisan consensus around reinstalling it is good. But there's other matters, like now, there's this amazing antiretroviral that's an injectable that a patient only has to use twice a year to effectively prevent becoming HIV positive. Now, Donald Trump has said, oh, well, he's reached an agreement, his administration, with Gilead Life Sciences, who produces it, to provide 2 million doses over, I think it's the next 5 years. Great for those 2 million patients in developing countries who can access it. But what about the other tens of millions of patients? So what it tends to lead to, and this is what happened in the early days of pilot projects and small, like NGO funded projects, is then this kind of horrible lottery between patients. It's a horrible lottery around who gets it. But then it places clinicians also in a bind, because the need, when it's much greater than what's available, it weighs on them to go home and to know that only certain patients have been helped and other people further back in the queue can't be helped. And literally in South Africa, given the unequal nature of our health system, it could literally boil down to a physical queue, because some patients in public health facilities actually end up starting to queue at 5 a.m. and maybe don't even see a clinician in that time. So the concept of the queue is very real in our country, but there needs to be, if that injection was rolled out universally, we could pretty much get close to ending AIDS. I'm very, very cautious about talking about ending AIDS. Published a few articles that explain why, but we should still have it as a goal in South Africa and globally. Have some ambition here. There could still end up being some cases, but just ram it as low as possible, these HIV cases. And also the deaths, critically for me. Because this paradox that the worst thing for me is it's closer than ever before, but the political will internationally on the part of the biggest donors gone. But also there's not minor matter Putin's aggression in Europe and the war in Ukraine, and the fact that European countries are rearming, which isn't a cheap undertaking, and many of them are also cutting foreign aid at the same time. So the actual whole global humanitarian projects in crisis at the moment, between the famine in Gaza, famine in Sudan now, collapse of massive parts of the global aid response, it's just never been bleaker in terms of, and this is part of the situation that we sit with in terms of the fundamental crisis of global humanitarianism. It's a huge sort of map of misery that I see when I look at it. I hope I don't sound too depressed, but it's important to be honest and not to present a varnished version of the truth. That's the situation. But I feel more motivated than ever to highlight the work of AIDS activists. And I can't accept the idea there's nothing to be done. The struggle has to continue. And I know for a fact that the restoration of PEPFAR funding, there was activism that happened there. So stuff that we can do, we just have to push and keep pushing. There isn't a plan B in terms of just sitting around doing nothing, but documenting it for me is key. So if any postgraduate students are listening to this, or historians looking for new topics, there's still a lot that isn't documented about the history of AIDS activism, particularly in terms of our neighbours and other countries in Africa. And I'm making a bit of headway around that with intellectual property focused, trade focused, human rights, legal activists. There's one that I'm sort of working with at the moment from Zimbabwe and one from Kenya, but the work is vast. So yeah, so reach out to me if you are looking for a topic.
Thank you very much. Thanks,
May it
Mandisa.
continue.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.